Welcome to Rooting for You, a seasonal gardening podcast for non-experts. I'm Tess, and I know nothing.
And I'm Alyce, and I know some things.
Each week we'll chat about one gardening topic and then discuss the effort-reward payoff by asking, is the juice worth the squeeze? Just a heads up, there might be a bit of swearing in this episode. You've been warned. Regular listeners of the podcast will know how much Alyce loves her bees. So much, she's obsessed. It's definitely one of her favourite topics. On an earlier episode of the podcast, we talked about all the things that someone should think about in deciding whether to get a beehive. And we also spoke about why bees are so important to us, our gardens, our ecosystem, not just for the honey, but bees are essential for pollinating our plants so we can grow food. Now, like me, having your own beehive might not be for you, but we still want to attract bees to our garden so they can come and work their pollination magic. So today we're talking about all the things that we can do to make our gardens a super inviting place for bees to come and visit. So Alyce, let's get stuck into it.
You're exactly right in saying that the easiest way to get bees into your garden is absolutely not to get a beehive. It is to make your garden a bee-friendly place. As someone that, as discussed previously, has 5 of them, they're a lot of work, but it's actually not a lot of work to make your garden a happy place for bees. So I think this will be a really great discussion for everyone that, like you, Tess, is keen on the pollinators, but not keen on the hive. Now, I want to stress this is the same discussion and the same importance for everyone listening if you're in the middle of the city or the middle of the country. It makes no difference. Bees are going to be just as important in both those places, and you'd actually be surprised at how many bees there are in a city. Like I'm talking CBD in a city. There are a lot of bees around. So if you can make it an oasis for them to come and visit, they absolutely will. And they will travel up to 7 kilometers to find food. So do not think just because there's no bees in your next door neighbor or on your street, you build it, they will come. In the bee episode, when I talked about my hives, we were talking exclusively about European honeybees because that's the bees that we keep for honey production. And they are excellent pollinators. But actually there's a lot of native bees in Australia as well, or, you know, wherever you are in the world, I'm sure you've got native bees as well. So in this discussion, we're kind of talking about all bees.
And native bees and the European bees, they'll do the same pollinating work?
Yes, they will. It is thought that the European honeybees will do a better job on our European crops, which is effectively most of the things we actually grow to eat and not native to Australia. So the native bees, it's a lot of debate around this, but they're not considered to be as good at pollinating food crops as the European honeybees, which is why we focus so much on them. But they're all got an important role to play in the ecosystem.
Let's get stuck into your list. What kind of things can we do to welcome the bees into our gardens?
Well, the first thing bees need, or one of the first things bees need, is water. Unsurprisingly, just like the rest of us, especially in summer, they need to have a drink. So the first thing you should do is you should make a spot in your garden for bees to come and have some water. Now, this doesn't need to be big, right? Because, like, it's a bee after all. They're not drinking that much. You know, some of the bigger, more grand options would be a bird bath or a pond or a kid's paddling pool. But really, a bucket or a saucer of water would actually be sufficient. Obviously, the smaller it is, the faster it's going to evaporate. So it might mean you've got to fill it up more often. But nothing, you know, over the top is needed here. A dish of water will also attract birds, which are really handy at controlling a lot of garden pests. So by doing something a bit bigger like a bird bath, you actually will get other benefits in the garden as well. But here's the really key, super important, can't stress enough. When you're putting water out for bees, if you just put a bucket of water out, they will drown. Bees need to land on something in order to drink the water. And if you just have a flat surface of water, they try and land on it and they can't get out again. And as I said, they'll drown. So what you need is something in this body of water for them to land on. Something floating is really good because that's always going to maintain out of the water. So something like a cork people often use. So, next time you're cracking a bottle of champagne, keep the cork and then float that in the water, and the bees will land on the cork and then can drink off the side of it. More natural looking options are lily pads and other water plants. If you had some kind of little pond situation, the bees will land on the lily pads, or simply rocks. So if you had a dish of water and you had some rocks in it that sat out of the water, the bees can land on the rocks and then walk down the sloping side to the edge of the water. Just imagine like you're going to the beach, right? It's the same kind of setup for the bees. So some water and something for them to land on are the key things there. The next important thing is planting food for bees. This is going to be the thing that really gets them into your garden. The nectar and the pollen in flowers is what bees feed on. So if there are no flowers in your garden, there is no bee food. So I think what would be a really interesting exercise for people is to step outside and have a look in your garden right now. Like, are there any flowers? It doesn't have to be a traditional flower like a rose. If you're growing a zucchini at the moment, you'll have zucchini flowers. That's still a flower for a bee to eat. But are there any flowers? If the answer is no, if you can't see a flower, then there's absolutely nothing drawing a bee to your garden. So you're not going to get any, as simple as that. We need flowers. Another thing is like rocket, when rocket goes to seed, which often it will be at the moment as the weather's warming up, those white flowers on the top of the rocket, they're great bee food. So you don't have to, you don't have some cottage garden going on to have an abundance of flowers for bees, but there does need to be flowers, full stop. Any other plant in the garden is not going to offer the bees any assistance whatsoever. So shall I go through some of my favourite ones for bees to eat?
Yeah, and on that, like, bees have a preference between what they like to eat. Like, are some flowers more attractive than other ones?
Yeah, you're totally right. Not all flowers are equal. And as much as I say any flower is going to be good, some flowers will be vastly preferred by bees. Honestly, I don't really know what makes a better flower and a worse flower as far as a bee's concerned, but you will notice in your garden when you pay attention that there's going to be certain plants that are going to have heaps of bees on them, and that's going to be the picks. So yeah, I mean, any flower is a benefit, but absolutely there are some that will do a much better job, especially when we're talking about attracting bees in the first place. If we want to really attract them, we've got to go for their favorites. It's kind of like a kid, if you want a kid to come over to you, you'd hand out an ice cream, not a stick of broccoli. So we'll pick the best ones.
Okay, so hit us with your list.
Okay, so my favourite thing, if there was only one thing you took from this episode, I would say plant some lavender. Who has ever seen a lavender bush in summer that is not absolutely teeming with bees? Every human loves lavender. You can keep it in the garden for that aesthetic, or you can bring it inside, like cut it, dry it, bring it inside, make potpourri, put it in a vase. It smells amazing. It flowers for a really long period, and that's particularly important for bees because some flowers, they go hard and fast and then they're gone. So it might offer the bees food for a couple of weeks, but there's 9 months of the year in the colder parts of Victoria and 12 months of the year in the rest of Australia where bees are eating. So we can't have something that just flowers for a short amount of time. Lavender flowers for a particularly long amount of time. So this is of great benefit to the bees. Now you can grow lavender in a pot, keep it really small. You can grow lavender in the garden. You can make a hedge of lavender. It will undoubtedly be found by a bee. So it's a favorite to plant around the veggie patch. So a lot of people, I probably wouldn't put it in the actual raised garden bed with your veggies because it is a perennial stay in the ground all year round. So I don't think you really want that limitation in a veggie patch. But next to the veggie patch, absolutely whack some lavender in.
It's good to know that you can do a pot as well.
Oh yeah, you can keep it tiny. And it's pretty hardy as well. Like it doesn't need a huge amount of water. It'll keep flowering pretty much in all situations. Have you got any in your garden?
No lavender, but it's definitely on the list of attracting the bees. Okie dokie, so we've got lavender. Any others on your recommendations?
Herbs. Bees love herb flowers. And I love talking about this one because there's benefits left, right, and center. We get to eat the herbs. The bees get to feed on the herb flowers, and herbs are so easy to grow. So it's just win, win, win. Some of the bee favorites are basil, rosemary, thyme, sage, lemon balm, chives, coriander, and parsley. So that's a pretty extensive list. There'll be something on there that you eat or, use in your cooking that you could also plant to benefit the bees. Again, by dotting those herbs around your veggie patch, in between your plants, you're kind of inviting the bees into the garden for the things that they really like. And then you're kind of saying, while you're here, if you could just pollinate everything else I need, that would be really handy. The thing I want you to remember, though, with the herbs is it's the flowers the bees want. So if you're growing parsley, when it's just a green parsley bush, it's actually not offering the bees any benefit. When it goes to flower, that's when it'll offer the bees benefit. So if you pull out your coriander and your parsley before it ever flowers, you're actually not getting any bee benefits from those plants. Things like rosemary, thyme, and sage, those perennial stay in the ground all year round herbs, they will naturally flower in the warmer months while still giving you the leaves to eat. So with those ones, without even thinking about it, they will flower, the bees will eat them, and the cycle will continue and be wonderful. With the annual herbs, you just need to let them flower for the bees to eat them.
So we've got lavender, we've got herbs. Anything else?
Well, one of my other favourite ones, aside from the herbs for the bees, is our edible flowers that we talked about last week. A lot of these are highly preferable to bees. And these are small plants, like we talked about in that episode. A lot of them can be grown in pots, so you don't need to have a massive garden to include some of these. They have the really pretty flowers, and they're great at attracting bees. And having such brightly coloured flowers as well is a physical sign or a visual cue to the bees that, hey, this is the place to come. And exactly like what I just said with the herbs, by dotting them around the garden, we're saying, hey, head over here. I've got this bright flower attracting you. And again, while you're here, pollinate my zucchini for me. So of the edible flowers we talked about last week, the cornflower, the marigold, those two I think would be the preference to bees. But I mean, I haven't read much about nasturtiums being popular for bees, but I see in my garden all the time, my nasturtiums always have bees going in them. So I'll anecdotally say bees love nasturtiums also. Some of the others that are really pretty, that aren't necessarily edible flowers, but make a great addition to any garden and bees bloody love them, are coneflower, which I think is also echinacea, cosmos, forget-me-not, foxgloves, poppies, roses, sunflowers, and zinnias. So these are all, some of those are annuals and some of those are perennials. So take your pick, and there's kind of different sizes in there. Like a zinnia is relatively small. I think you could grow it in a pot. I mean, it's not small like a pansy, don't get me wrong, but it's not like a rose bush either. But, there's a good collection there of things that are beautiful that will also be really attractive to bees. So these are great things to kind of plant around the veggie patch. And we've got the double purpose, the beautiful flowers for you to enjoy, the food for the bees. And then with the edible ones, we've got the triple purpose. So that's always a big focus of mine in the garden. It's like, if you're going to put the effort in, or if you're going to give it the space, give it the attention, give it the resources, we want it to have that double, if not triple benefit.
Any other flowers on your list?
Well, the next group I was thinking about that's really good for bee food is berries, citrus, and passion fruit. Now, this is a funny one because you would often be attracting bees because you want to pollinate your berries and your citrus and your passion fruit. Like, because they're the food crop, often we're thinking, okay, we need to attract the bees in to do the work on these particular plants. But the good thing about those three in the edible kind of bush and vine cane category is that they are particularly appealing for bees in and of themselves. So by having them in the garden, the bees are going to turn up and they're going to create, they're going to do the pollination and create the fruit on those plants. I actually was in my berry cage yesterday and all my berries are flowering at the moment. So I'm expecting a huge amount of blackberries, loganberries, tayberries, and raspberries are all going nuts. And there were so many bees. around them, it was incredible. Like you'd think there was a beehive in there, and there's definitely not. So, those plants are double benefits again of being good food for you, but particularly good food for bees. So if any of those fit your list as far as edibles, really, really, really good ones for the dual purpose. Another reason, Tess, that I want you to get a passion fruit.
Do you know, I was at the hardware store the other day and I was looking at the arches. They were just calling them arches, not arbors. But I'm like, it could be good for a passion fruit.
I think it could be next DIY project. There's one more group of plants that are really good bee food. This is native plants, Australian native plants. I'm not an expert on Australian native plants, but I have put together a list of some that I know bees love, and they're kind of different sizes. So we've got things like native daisies, which are really small, right through to like tea trees and macadamias, which are massive trees. Obviously, those type aren't going to fit in everyone's garden. But for the native plants that bees love, we've got grevillea, Christmas bush, pincushion trees, native daisies, native violets, macadamia, tea tree, and bottlebrush. So if you've got a bit more space, and especially you, Tess, who have already got like a bit of a native, not a bit, you have a beautiful native garden already going on, there might be some of the small ones like the native daisies or the native violets that you could kind of dot into your native garden that will also do a really good job of attracting the bees to the garden, to the veggie patch.
Now, you've literally just said that you're not an expert on natives, so you can pass on this question. But are those natives like Victorian cooler climate specific?
No, actually. You can grow macadamia in Victoria, but really most of the time they're grown kind of northern New South Wales, Queensland, in those more tropical regions. Same with tea tree. So this is definitely not a Southern Australia list. It's got things for all of us in there.
And obviously there's so many different climates across Australia that do check out whatever's growing locally for your natives.
Yeah, exactly. And look, if you Google this, like, Sydney natives that bees like, I mean, someone will have absolutely made the list for you. So go into more detail there. And I mean, it is important, obviously, to pick the plant size to the garden you have. Should you have some space, I would love, should you have some space and the right temperature, I would love a macadamia tree. Fresh macadamias are amazing.
Okie dokie. So we have our water that we've put out with something for the bees to land on, a cork or some rocks. We've got a bunch of different things that we can now plant. Is there anything else that you recommend for getting the bees in?
There is, and this one is incredibly important. It cannot be overstated, but it's also not particularly sexy. That is, we need to ditch the sprays and the chemicals in our house and in our garden. So I'm not just talking about what you spray on your plants. I'm talking about fly sprays. If you spray for ants, spiders, anything like that around the house, the same way that's going to kill a fly, it's absolutely going to kill a bee. I've seen bees be poisoned before, and it is an absolute horrible sight. You can tell by looking at them, like that's how they've died. Absolutely try and live without these chemical sprays. Basically anything that's an insecticide in a aerosol can is deadly for bees. And a lot of other beneficial insects you might want in your garden as well. Like it doesn't discriminate on which insects the spray kills. So ditch it from inside the house and around the house. And when you're in the garden, try not to use any chemicals on your plants, because these are the same plants that the bees are going to then come and sit on and feed from. So if you've poisoned them, you're going to inadvertently poison the bees. So I would say, sometimes we do need to use pesticides in the garden. It's inevitable, but stick to the ones that are considered safe for organic farming. These will say on the label quite clearly. They will be the least toxic for bees. And also it's kind of common sense. Like if you're reading a packet that's got 4,000 warnings to you on how to use that product, probably safely say it's going to create havoc with smaller creatures in the garden as well. Think carefully about all the chemicals that you're using around the place, because these will absolutely take a bee out, no questions asked. And the other thing that this kind of ties into, which isn't helping bees in our garden per se, but if we're talking just generally about saving the bees, it's not just the sprays you use in your garden, in your home, that will kill bees, but also the food that other people grow on your behalf. How is that grown and what pesticides did they use? So if you can buy organic, this is going to make a massive difference to the bees generally, because in the same way we don't want bees on our food crops being poisoned by pesticides, commercially, if you're buying food, broccoli that's been sprayed, I mean, that will have impacted on bees as well. So you kind of get a choice in your own garden, but also in the things that you buy, how they're grown will also make a massive difference.
Are there products out there that will keep, for example, ants, mosquitoes, will keep them away, that aren't, like, deter them without poisoning them?
I'm sure there are. I mean, I'm a bit of a hippie with this stuff. I don't really use anything, but something like a mosquito coil, I don't know if that would damage bees actually. With ants, like people use like corn flour and corn flour and things like that to kind of like block their pathways. I mean, frankly, they're probably not as effective as the chemicals are, but there are a lot of, alternative natural things that we can do to kind of keep these pests at bay. I mean, the good old fly squat or get a fly screen might also help with the flies.
So you mentioned a moment ago that bees are a year-round creature and that we do want to give them something to feed and we want to attract them year-round. But is there a reason why we're doing this particular topic right now in spring?
Absolutely, because so many of these plants that I've suggested growing, the ideal time to plant them is actually spring. So we did the bee episode in winter because I wanted people thinking about bees before kind of bee season started in spring. But now we're in spring, the time to get bees has pretty much passed. But what happens in spring is bees build up their population massively. They lay a huge amount of babies and they all need to be fed. So actually, spring is one of the most important times to feed bees. It's the time that we plant a lot of the bee food. And coming into summer, which is only a few weeks away, is when the water requirement for bees becomes particularly important. In spring, things are usually pretty moist, so it's okay. But coming into the warmer months, it's where the water comes in. So I think right now, end of spring is the ideal time to start thinking about what we can do in our own gardens to attract and take care of the bees.
So the big question, is the juice worth the squeeze? This is where we look at the effort-reward ratio of today's topic. The categories are superstar, high effort, high reward. Completing this will make you feel like an absolute rock star. Best on ground, low effort, high reward. Quick wins and fill-ins, low effort, low reward. And finally, the wooden spoon, high effort, but not much reward.
Now, Tess, I know when we talked in the bee episode, you were very not keen on the hive, which I totally understand, but you were particularly keen on focusing on, what you could do to really encourage the bees into your garden. So I know this episode has been kind of particularly something on your mind over the last couple of months. Tell me, how do you feel about setting up your bee-friendly garden now that we've gone through all these tips? Where's it sitting on the squeezy juice? What can you see yourself embracing?
It's a best on ground. The reward so high and the options not that difficult that we've discussed. The water was something that I hadn't thought about doing. So easy to do that, to have just a little dish outside for, I'm not going to do a paddling pool worth of water, but the best thing that I'm taking out of this episode is which ties in with our topic last week about edible flowers, the triple whammy of an edible flower being something that we want to eat, something that's really nice to look at, but also something that the bees will like as well, and companion planting them in the nooks and crannies of what I already have in my garden as I've started my spring patch already. I think that is just an absolute winner. Really excited about that.
Now I've listened to you list it out. I don't think that's a triple win. I think that's a quadruple win because I didn't even mention the pest control aspect. So, win-win, win-win-win.
Rooting for You is hosted by Alyce and Tess, artwork by Lauren Janine. You can find us on Instagram @rootingforyoupod or email rootingforyou@alycealexandra.com. And remember, we are rooting for you.